Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 7 from The Orb. Okie Dokie, it's The Orb on Kompakt. So this marks a bit of an interesting demarcation point in The Orb's story. Previous albums always saw Patterson working with lots of different people. Maybe there'd be one specific person he worked with more than the others, like Chris Weston or Andy Hughes, but there'd always be long credits lists and a wide variety of collaborators. This pattern would mostly carry over to the other albums, but from this point onwards he'd mostly switch off between two primary collaborators, Youth and Thomas Fehlmann. They'd rarely show up on the same album together. I think No Sounds Are Out of Bounds is the only one to feature both ever since. But while the albums with Youth generally still had really long credits lists, the ones with Fehlmann would typically have no extra collaborators, and occasionally even border on being Fehlmann's own solo albums. That was a common criticism of this album in particular, the fact that it sounds like a Thomas Fehlmann solo album and not like an Orb album. Okie Dokie shows the Orb moving away from the highly detailed and often super goofy style they're known for. No longer were you going to hear all the random vocal snippets and zany ambience you've come to expect beyond maybe a few very short isolated moments. Instead, we get a much more straightforward German ambient techno sound. Now, if you talked to me back when I was in high school, I would have said I hated Okie Dokie and that it was my least favorite Orb album overall as a result. I used to feel that Fehlmann's influence watered down what made the Orb special, and that his contributions didn't have quite the same soul to them, I guess. That he turned what used to be such a fun band into something much more average and run-of-the-mill for the genre. Even boring. That said, even if I do still see this as primarily a Fehlmann solo album to this day, I have really come to appreciate it for what it is in all the years since. Say what you will about the Fehlmann-driven Orb albums, there is definitely an easily recognizable style behind them that you can't get from anyone else. And to say this thing's lost all of the previous Orb magic isn't entirely accurate either. It's just a different kind of magic that happens to be a lot more subtle in its approach. It's also worth noting that my perspective on this album softened even more after I heard Thomas Fehlmann's actual solo albums. I checked them out a few years ago when I reviewed his Los Lagos album, and I'll put a card up there if you want more detailed thoughts on his solo work. But long story short, most of Fehlmann's solo work is a lot more minimalistic than even this. Like, several of his albums are just straight minimal techno with no twists at all, including the one I actually covered. His Gute Luft soundtrack album in particular highlighted the value of this project to me, given how he directly repurposed quite a bit of material from Okie Dokie, and those repurposed moments were my favorite parts of that album. This project may not be as wild and crazy as most Orb albums, but to say Patterson's influence was non-existent doesn't seem accurate to me anymore. He definitely brought some color and personality that Fehlmann wouldn't have really brought to the table on his own. And regardless of who contributed what or how fundamentally Orb-like it is compared to what came before, I think it does speak to this album's quality that I can still pretty easily recall what the majority of this album sounds like without needing to think too hard, and it kept me coming back even back in the days when I swore it was their worst album. I will say that the album doesn't exactly start with its best foot forward. Opener Complication is kind of just a decent shifting dub techno track with very little in the way of texture. I guess it does work as a device to let you know what you're getting into, with Fehlmann's production style and the overall pacing of the album. Kinda lacking on the progression front, but in a way that's the case for all tracks here. There's some nice piano samples thrown around, and those lead synth stabs that take up most of the track do remind me maybe kind of a heartbeat, which may be where the title is derived from. But it's not exactly the most engaging or attention-grabbing start you could have picked. It does really for me immediately after that, though, as we get into Lunik TM, which features a half-sung vocal performance from Schneider TM, going over a blocky and whooshing pad and some particularly bouncy minimal drum beats. This one just sounds especially cool. The vocals make for a really effective hook and add some personality that the original single version from their Kompakt EP didn't have. Although that version's a touch faster and has stronger percussion if you're interested in looking into that. From there we get a bunch of the most rhythmic cuts in the bunch, such as the plodding beats and wobbling bass lines of Ripples, the even more heavily grooving Captain Korma, which is easily the best bass line in the bunch, going over some screechy pads, and segueing perfectly into the honking textured repetitiveness of Can Can. All really solid cuts, all relatively danceable and plenty of fun to listen to, all with their own distinct approach to these dub techno and tech house formulas. We then get a pair of tracks that feel more like interludes to me. We get Rolo, which has one of the few moments where Pedersen snuck in a goofy vocal snippet, repeatedly asking, "Can you repeat the word Rolo?" And from there builds into this cloudy mix of glittering ambient melodies. Admittedly, without that vocal snippet, I would have found this to be one of the more memorable cuts in the bunch, but it does still sound quite nice and well textured. Definitely not a skip. And then there's Beatitude, which has all these guitar sounds covered in dub echoing effects, and an even stronger plodding beat. Bit more memorable, if not really one of my big favorites. Kind of has a less than pleasant vibe to it, but it's still, that's cool. But then we get Cool Harbour, which almost certainly is my favorite cut in the bunch. Just has this super striking, bouncing groove to it, slapping beats, catchy progressions of synth strings, and snappy bass melodies. Even back in the days when I least enjoyed this album, I loved this track from the first time I heard it and would come back to the album just to hear it. May not bang as hard as something like Captain Korma, but it comes very close while also having a much more beautiful and open sounding mix. Now, from this point onwards, the album does shift towards a much more ambient focus, and while I'm on the topic of beautiful and open sounding, that's what following track Traumvogel does better than any other track here. It just sounds so freaking gorgeous with all these lush ambient pads, some that waver on and off to give a bit more rhythm to the mix, but also featuring lots of harp plucks and some other sound effects. It really does feel like it's evoking flying. Like as if you were in a dream riding on top of a giant bird that's like going over an ocean with a sunset behind it, and you can almost hear the wings flapping occasionally too. Fitting for the title, which is literally German for dream bird. Now, the rest of the album does get a bit spottier. Heck, this was the point at which the album completely fell off and never recovered back when I was in high school. Though the stretch obviously doesn't bother me nearly as much as it used to. Because before Sibrishi Music is a collab with ambient producer Ulf Lohmann, and even shares its title with an album Lohmann put out in 2001, because before. And I guess this one's alright. It doesn't have as much texture, just a lot of blocky ambient pads, forming big major key chords and evoking a sense of heart-sick nostalgia. Admittedly, it did kinda give me the same feeling that other Fehlmann produced ambient cuts like Dillman or some of the stuff from Baghdad Batteries, where it's just like really sickly sweet, almost to the point of being a turnoff in and of itself. Though I can't deny that it does have a lot of emotion put into it. It's still alright. Then there's Tin Can, which is an even more subtle and ambient-centric companion to the earlier track Can Can. It does have a particularly chilling vibe to it that I quite like, and the way they utilize the same whooshing percussion patterns to two very different effects, I think is pretty neat. And then Kompagna Zandic Mix is just a straight-up reprise of the penultimate cut from Bicycles and Tricycles, spelled slightly differently, with a different subtitle and like 2 minutes shorter, but otherwise they're pretty much the exact same track. Same thick and noisy ambient pads, same menacing loops of bells and synth patterns, same desolate and depraved atmosphere. I'm not sure whether I prefer this version to the Groovedware mix from their last album. On one hand, that version being longer intensified that feeling of descending through purgatory or something. Though this one fits a heck of a lot better in the album's track listing, as it's surrounded by all these other tracks that have a much more similar sound and approach. I mentioned that it was super out of place on Bicycles and Tricycles, but in this context, it fits right at home. Now, the album's ending stretch does particularly slide off for me. Falkenbrook is an ambient companion to Captain Korma with the same screechy pads, but none of the beats or bass lines, basically stripping that track of the elements I actually most enjoyed about it. It is a lot more dramatic and a lot less goofy than the track it's based off of, but it's not nearly as fun to listen to. But that's nothing compared to Snowbow, the album closer on the standard edition of the album, but just not particularly appealing at all. Combining these really basic and sickly sweet ambient melodic loops that get grating fast with these squelchy sound effects that sound like stepping in mud. This is one of my least favorite tracks the Orb ever made, and ending the album on this note especially makes it so unsatisfying and anticlimactic. So thank goodness the widely available Spotify version keeps the bonus track Edelgrun, also known as Edelblau if you have the Japanese version of this CD, though I'm pretty sure it's the exact same track. And yeah, this is a far stronger and more satisfying album closer, containing all these very pretty guitar loops and major key synth cores that have much more of a laid-back, summery feel going over a fairly sparse beat. Feels a lot more emotionally charged as well, despite how low-key it is. Feels like you're sitting out in the porch of a cabin and out in the countryside and looking over a green field with a clear blue sky above you. That's a much nicer and more pleasant note to go out on, and even kind of prevents Snowbow from being an outright skip, because now there's actually a payoff to its minimal loops, and a return to something more structured after all these cold ambient cuts. But yeah, that's everything on Okie Dokie, It's the Orb on Kompakt. I still wouldn't call this one of my absolute favorite projects in the Orb catalog, but it has been a major grower with me as the years have gone by. Sure, it may focus entirely on Thomas Fehlmann's vision to the point of almost being his solo album, but it does really play to his particular strengths as a producer and gives all these really simplistic compositions just enough of an identity to all remain really striking and easily memorable even in its weakest moments. And it was successful enough in its execution where his style became a crucial part of the Orb style as a whole. I don't think it's quite consistent enough for me to qualify it as properly great, but it's got lots of excellent standouts, and I still feel inclined to put this one on semi-regularly. If you're itching for the wackier side of the Orb, this isn't going to deliver that. You'll have to stay tuned for the next album for that. But there's still easily enough solid material here to merit being worth giving a shot, and I've had a lot of good memories with it. So I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. So leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
Beautiful.